Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, as a nation searches for answers, a 22-year-old murder suspect is in custody in the shooting death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. New details on how the suspect's own family helped to end the manhunt, and the crucial evidence the FBI says was provided by his roommate. President Trump now calling for the death penalty. Utah's Attorney General Derek Brown joins us moments from now to weigh in on the search for answers and what's to come. Also, a watershed moment. Where does the country go from here with lawmakers and American citizens on edge? Utah's Governor Spencer Cox delivering a powerful message today on the state of American politics in the wake of recurring political violence.
This is certainly about the tragic death, political assassination of Charlie Kirk. But it is also much bigger than an attack on an individual. It is an attack on all of us. It is an attack on the American experiment. It is an attack on our ideals. We will never be able to solve all the other problems, including the violence problems that people are worried about, if we can't have a clash of ideas safely and securely. Even, especially those ideas with which you disagree.
And that is where we begin with team coverage on the investigation out of Utah and the impact this moment is having across the country, including here in Washington on Capitol Hill. Joining us with the latest, Bloomberg's Miles Miller in New York, alongside Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, who was with me here in Washington. Miles, where to begin with a day that brought forth much news? It was President Trump himself who announced on television this morning that a suspect had been apprehended. Now we're dealing with charges. What's the latest?
Yeah, so we know that this suspect in this incident is going to face murder as well as weapons charges, as well as charges that he obfuscated, that he was trying to obstruct justice. What we know as of now is that the suspect in this incident took great lengths to conceal what he did. Surely he climbed to the top of that roof, he had a rifle in his hand, pulled the trigger, and then tried to escape. And what we know is that it was in the moments after where he tried to hide the gun and get away. It was just yesterday when that suspect's father saw him on the news, and when he walked through his door, said to him, "Were you the person who shot Charlie Kirk?" And he said, "Yes, I was." And then it was that point when he called a family friend who happens to be a task force officer, and that task force officer called the FBI, and that led to this young man's arrest, just 22 years old and now in a world of trouble.
Boy, that's for sure. Why is this going on the state level and not the federal level? We saw Kash Patel and other federal authorities there today, Miles. We're going to be speaking next with the Attorney General from Utah. Why this direction?
Yeah, it appears as though in Utah, they have the death penalty. So that's the one thing that Donald Trump said he wanted to see in this case. Is something that that they said for the long part is what they're going to pursue in this. A lot of times when the state government takes the charge, or state police and law enforcement take the charge in the investigation, they want to see that through. But sometimes you see the parallel path. With Luigi Mangione, you saw the parallel path of both state and federal charges, but here it appears it's just going to be state charges. It's likely because these charges are so severe already on the state level that you may not need the federal charges to come in. But we hope to hear from the Attorney General just about why they're deciding to choose to go the state route. But I think most of it is because of how serious the charges are in the state.
Thank you so much, Miles, for all the great reporting the last couple of days. He's been living this for us and bringing a lot of information. As we turn now to Michael Shepard here in Washington, the other side of this is, of course, the spate of political violence that many Americans, it seems, Mike, are growing used to. The rhetoric today has been hot. The rhetoric last evening was hot. The President of the United States himself, in the driveway of the White House as he was leaving, talked about radical left lunatics out there. We just have to beat the hell out of them. How concerned are we about retribution?
Well, the concern about retribution remains high. And in fact, the New York Times had an analysis that they published of social media postings, and that showed that mentions of the word civil war had reached on social media levels not seen since the attempt on Donald Trump's life during the 2024 presidential campaign. And that is a concern, that a lot of the rhetoric around this has become so heated, and you're hearing officials now like Utah's Governor Spencer Cox calling for a lowering of the temperature and a return to civil discourse that takes place without resorting to arms. And yet social media, of course, is where we saw so many of those horrible images of Charlie Kirk's assassination, and that really has helped stoke some of those emotions and some of that outrage. And it's interesting that the president has been calling out the radical left, lunatics as he calls it, but that also overlooks perhaps some of the violence committed against Democrats. You can think back to the hammer attack on House Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, and then, of course, the assassination of, in their home, of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband. And so both sides, the rhetoric is quite heated, and we are starting to see some of that finger-pointing crop up, Joe.
We also remember the arson attack against Governor Shapiro.
Absolutely.
A notable contrast in the messaging coming from the president here and the governor of Utah. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, thank you as ever for the perspective, Mike. Here's more of FBI Director Kash Patel on the status of this investigation and what is ahead for local, state, and federal officials.
This is very much an ongoing investigation, as the governor said, and we will continue to work with state and local authorities to develop the investigation, to provide them the evidence they need for their ongoing prosecutions, and we will be here to answer every call they absolutely have, as long as it takes, for as long as we need to find and apprehend whatever suspects were involved in this crime.
Joining us now for an important conversation is Utah's Attorney General Derek Brown. Attorney General, thank you for being with us. I know you're very short on sleep and you've got a lot to do here. Is the accused, I should say, cooperating with this investigation?
Well, at this point, let me just say we are relieved. It's been a very sleepless couple of days. And I think that yes, we do have the suspect in custody. But I think what's most important is from the very moment this began, there was a level of cooperation and coordination among law enforcement officials that I've never seen. And this is a model for how it should be done, not just in Utah, but across the nation. Literally, we have our county sheriff, our county prosecutor, the state level. And literally from the moment this happened, I was on with the governor, who was on with the president. We're working with DOJ. I mean, this is a model for how these kinds of things should be conducted, what should take place. And so I think that coordination was very helpful. And we had 7,000 to 8,000 different tips that came in, because the reality is, I mean, there's 3.5 million people in Utah. It's a large state, but the reality is when 3,000 people are at an event and they witness this kind of thing take place, it's personal. Everybody knows somebody who was there. I have close family members who were there. I have staff members who were there. I heard about it first from close family members before the media or the law enforcement was even reporting it. And so really what we're trying to do now is, as law enforcement, we're going to, press charges and take this as far as we can from a legal standpoint, make sure that justice is done. But I think it's also important, as Governor Cox mentioned today, that we don't just dial down the rhetoric, but we really learn how we can be unified as a people, what we can do to come together.
Yeah, well, that is something that a lot of people feel is a great challenge for this country right now, Attorney General. I want to ask you about the investigation itself and what you have yet to learn. 11,000 leads, we understand, according to the FBI, to chase down at this point. Governor Cox spoke briefly about the way this unfolded with the suspect's roommate. Let's listen.
The content of these messages included messages affiliated with the contact Tyler, stating a need to retrieve a rifle from a drop point, leaving the rifle in a bush, messages related to visually watching the area where a rifle was left, and a message referring to having left the rifle wrapped in a towel. The messages also refer to engraving bullets and a mention of a scope and the rifle being unique.
Attorney General, with the roommate in mind, with 11,000 leads in mind, are you going to be looking for collaborators or other folks that may have worked with the suspect?
Absolutely. We're looking for everything. At this point, the information we have is still fairly limited. So we have someone in custody. And what we're now doing, we have a probable cause statement that you've seen. Within the next couple of days, we're looking at Tuesday, there will be charging documents filed. But the real task right now is to piece through this information, get things like what was said on the phone, what was texted, whatever information we can. And then that will help us in the upcoming prosecution. And then we will work as well with the feds. And so this will be a collaborative effort between the two to make sure that this individual is brought to justice.
Do we know who bought the gun yet? Do we know where he got it?
Those are pieces we don't know, but I can assure you that no stone will be left unturned here in the state of Utah as we do everything we can to make sure that he is held accountable.
One of the more remarkable parts of this 24-hour period is learning the suspect essentially turned himself in, spurred on by his father. Have you spoken with this young man's dad?
I have not, but that is one of the things that makes this interesting. And I think as things progressed, I think people, including his father, realized that this is, that we were getting closer and closer, and we were going to get him. And I'm glad that we got him, because what this does now is speaking from on a personal note and knowing so many people who were there, there's a catharsis as well. I mean, my job as Attorney General is to make sure that justice is served, but there's also a corresponding need for our community to feel a catharsis and a healing from the situation. And so, I mean, I literally, after spending hours on with law enforcement right after this happened, middle of the night before I went to sleep, my last call was to a family member who was there and was processing the trauma and grief of what he had experienced and what it was like to be barricaded in a classroom, not knowing what was going on outside. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to process and heal as a state. And I'm confident that this will be an opportunity to bring us together. And as law enforcement, we'll make sure that the right thing happens.
I'm just curious, before I ask you about the charges here, when his father brought him to talk to the minister, did he know the minister was on the task force? Did he intend to turn his son in? I don't know if this is a Mormon family or otherwise. Could they have been going to pray together, or was that in fact the plan?
That's a good question. I don't have that information, and I need to be cautious because I'm, as someone who's working with the prosecution, I mean, you're asking the right questions, but also I need to be careful not to prejudice that. But you're right, that does make it a really interesting factor in terms of how this person was turned over, because that's not something that you generally hear, and you would expect something like this to end with a standoff, and in fact, it was just the opposite.
President wants the death penalty, Attorney General. Will charges be filed here only on the state level, or the federal level, or both?
Well, right now we will be working in coordination with the feds, and we've been discussing the different options. Well, a lot of what takes place now is the fact finding and figuring out what facts we have at our disposal. And then a lot of those facts, as we get them, and we're still getting them, as you know, at this moment, that will have a huge part to play in what charges are brought. I mean, obviously, in the probable cause statement, there are things like aggravated murder and obstruction of justice. But we anticipate that when we have more information in the next couple of days, that'll help us round things out. And then the charging statement will be filed most likely next Tuesday. And at that point in time, we'll have a much better sense of where the charges are and what we'll be doing going forward. And then that will also answer the question in terms of the federal and state interplay. But I can assure you there's been a very high level of coordination. And, you know, I'm thrilled at the way that our county prosecutors like Jeff Gray have done a good job of handling what needs to be done here and working with so many different levels of law enforcement, because that's in a very complicated situation like this, that is the solution, and that's how we get someone here.
Well, as the top law enforcement officer in the state of Utah, do you support that idea of pursuing the death penalty, considering he turned himself in?
Well, at this point, I can't say because we don't know all the information yet. And so this is absolutely something we'll be discussing. You can count on the fact that this will be a topic of conversation. But, simply because I am part of the process, it's not something I'm going to opine on. But it's definitely something that is being discussed. I can assure you that.
We'll take you at your word there, Attorney General. I hope you get some rest this weekend, along with everyone on your team. It has been a long week. Utah's Attorney General Derek Brown with us live on Bloomberg. Coming up, more reaction from lawmakers on how the killing of Charlie Kirk is reverberating through communities around the country. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You can't simply secure your way out of the challenges that we face right now. It's not simply security. We do need security. We need to make sure that we're providing that to members, to staff, and to the general public. But there's something deeper going on in our society as well that we have to address.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Part of my conversation there with Republican Congressman Brian Stile of Wisconsin on yesterday's Balance of Power, discussing what's being done to ensure lawmaker safety on Capitol Hill. He's chair of the House Administration Committee, so this falls in his portfolio, the panel that oversees funding for member security. And of course, it comes after reports of political activists and lawmakers from both parties canceling public events after Charlie Kirk was shot and killed on a college campus in Utah on Wednesday. Joining us now with more on this and some of the other stories we're following, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. It's always great to have you, Congresswoman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd like to start with that matter of security. I'd love your greater thoughts on the political violence that this country is, I fear, growing used to. The fact of the matter is most lawmakers I have talked to this week have been very modest about their own security. When I've asked them if they feel safe, if they think they should have a security detail, no one has demanded that. But reports suggest that there is an outcry on Capitol Hill for more to be done. And I wonder what you think when you walk out the door in the morning, if you think you should have a security detail.
Well, Joe, and it's good to be back with you. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about this because even my own opinion has shifted over the last number of years. My first answer to this question is always that, I serve in the most representative body in the entire world, the one that is the closest to the people, and access to their representatives is something that we absolutely have to maintain. And, when security is around you tightly, people get intimidated and they feel less comfortable approaching their own representative. At the same time, though, I had a pipe bomb delivered to my office along with 15 other politicians around the country, where my return address was and my name was on the return address of every package. Wow. The bomb had to be detonated in the stairwell of my district office building. There are Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, attacked with a hammer. I've gotten countless death threats. I have on and off police outside my house. And then it's to the point where making sure that my constituents are protected when I am somewhere, especially if there's been public notice, and protecting myself and my family is essential. So an increased security presence needs to occur. How we deal with that is something that we need to discuss to maintain that balance between accessibility and security.
Well, it's chilling hearing you describe all of that. That pipe bomb was not a fake, I think, is part of your point. How does it make you feel when the president says that this is the fault of the radical left?
It is incomprehensible to me that we have a president who is not able to meet this moment. Every major elected official that I know, Democratic elected official that I know, including myself, put out a statement of sorrow for me, initially wishing Mr. Kirk hopefully a quick recovery, and then expressing sorrow about his killing, and also that we need to make sure that political violence is never the answer. And I, whether we disagree vehemently or not, We all have to make sure we tamp things down. And the president is ratcheting things up. George W. Bush, after 9/11, when the World Trade Center was attacked, the Pentagon, the plane crash in Pennsylvania, he met the moment. He brought us together. He tamped down Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And President Obama, after the Mother Emanuel killings, did the same and brought the country together. Blaming one side or the other is not going to enable us to be able to cool things down and make sure that we work together. I do thank Governor Cox, who is really taking the right tone here from Utah. And that's really the example we need to follow.
Of course, noteworthy that Governor Cox is a Republican who you're complimenting here, who said our adversaries want violence. Our adversaries want violence. We have bots from Russia, China, all over the world trying to instill disinformation. I would encourage you to ignore those. This is a big part of this. And by the way, noteworthy, I remember very well when President George W. Bush visited a mosque. It was on the 17th of September, 2001. Is there an equivalent move that this president could make at this time now?
I hope he uses the moment to address the country and emanate healing words and ask us all to, find our better angels and come together and try to be less vitriolic. People feel very strongly about, a lot of issues right now on both sides. And I think, to quote or to paraphrase Mr. Kirk, we should put our phones down. Tell our kids to put our phones down. Stop drowning in social media and outrage and really try to come together as human beings. Human contact, human communication, making sure that we get to know each other better as people. When I have an opportunity, Joe, to talk to another colleague on the other side of the aisle and I'm trying to win them over on an issue they disagree with me on, it is always so much easier when we're looking at each other in the eye, when we're sitting down next to each other. I have always found that people like to help people that they like and that they think are nice. And you don't get to know somebody and know whether they're nice or if they have any good qualities unless you really try to speak to them directly. We all need to work on that.
That's right. I've only got about a minute left, Congresswoman. What's going to happen when everybody comes back? There was already no trust between Democrats and Republicans, which is why we keep talking about a government shutdown. I'm guessing we're not going to have a post-9/11 kind of unity here. Will Democrats and Republicans work together to fund the government?
Well, speaking as a senior appropriator, there is certainly the opportunity to do that, and the ball is in Republicans' court. I mean, we can work together on a bipartisan funding bill, make sure that we don't terminate the Obamacare tax credits and bring the cost of health care down, make life more affordable. I'm going to go shopping tomorrow for my family's tailgate supplies. And, there's a Trump tailgate tax that we all pay, whether it's ground beef or produce or cheese. And the Trump tailgate tax has to be addressed. We have to make sure that we come together, and we have an opportunity to do that. But if Republicans take this go-it-alone strategy and ignore the affordability crisis that Americans are facing, then they will be the ones that shut the government down.
I think we just got a little preview of the Democratic messaging, the tailgate tax. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, thank you as always for talking with us on Bloomberg, and we'll see you when you get back in town. Coming up, first Los Angeles, then Washington, next Memphis, where President Trump says he's sending the National Guard. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it's increasingly clear that we're going to get to at least 3%. With the cooler inflation data that we're getting now, you can really start thinking about, do they actually move below 3%?
Housing is in a recession. The auto sector is in tough shape. These sectors of the economy are the ones that are going to pick up when the Fed starts cutting.
A majority of Americans are still not feeling the effect of the tariffs, or maybe not allowing the tariffs to affect their purchasing decisions.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with some of the voices from earlier today on surveillance here on Bloomberg as markets await next week's Fed decision. We turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta, who joins us live on assignment from Miami. Hey, Creedy.
Hi, Joe. Lots going on in the markets today. Really a tale of several different stories. I got to start off with the macro, though, because when you look at the stock market, it closed down, but it's a tale of two tech stories underneath the hood. On the one hand, your best performers were the tech stories, the tech favorites, your Teslas, your Nvidias, your Apples, you name it. But on the downside, you had plenty of tech movers there, too. Oracle really taking a breather from their monumental move earlier this week. You had Amazon under pressure as well. There's an FTC probe there on their search engines, and Alphabet as well, very much a part of that. So Google shares, for example, GOOG, were very much part of the downside. So if you're a tech company, it could have gone either way for you, and that really impacted the macro. Underneath the hood, though, today was a big day for IPOs. You had 4 new stocks listing. All actually were received fairly well. There's now a question in the markets of whether or not this rally that we're seeing, today being the exception, but the broad rally that we've seen mostly is actually one that's going to be staying, to the point that it's encouraging a lot of new companies to debut publicly. So some interesting news there. We got to see if it sustains throughout the next couple of weeks. The IPO market is always tricky. Lastly, Joe, I want to just end on one sector that, of course, we're keeping a very close eye on, and that is the drug makers, the vaccine makers in particular, moving sharply lower, really contributing to the losses on the index because of a report that the U.S., the United States government, may be looking at connecting COVID vaccines to deaths in children. Now, that's just, of course, a report, but it was enough to move the markets to some of the COVID vaccine favorites. I'm talking about Merck, Pfizer, Moderna. Those, of course, are companies that have diversified away from vaccines, but nevertheless, in people's minds, very much associated with it and lower on the day across the board.
All right, Creedy. Make your way home safe. We'll see you back in Washington on Monday at Bloomberg's Creedy Gupta in Miami. We thank you, as always. Happening this hour, the Treasury Department just issued a statement after an emergency G7 call. Secretary Bessent is pushing for the G7 to impose tariffs as high as 100% on China and India for their purchases of Russian oil, all in an effort to convince Vladimir Putin to end his war in Ukraine. Here's President Trump earlier today on Fox News.
So is your patience run out with Putin?
Yeah, it's sort of running out and running out fast, but it does take two to tango. It's amazing. When Putin wants to do it, Zelensky didn't. When Zelensky wanted to do it, Putin did. Now Zelensky wants to, and Putin is a question mark. But we're going to have to come down very, very strong. It'll be hitting very hard with sanctions to banks and having to do with oil and tariffs also.
Joining us with more now, Rebbecah Heinrichs, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and Director of the Keystone Defense Initiative. It's great to have you back on Bloomberg, Rebbecah. What do you make of the equivalency that President Trump is trying to draw here between Putin and Zelensky, knowing, of course, that Russia invaded Ukraine? Does it really take two to tango?
Well, to end the war, both countries have to stop. But of course, Zelensky has been completely willing to abide by really the U.S.-led effort with NATO to implement a ceasefire. So Ukraine has been completely willing to do that for months now. And there really is great solidarity between and among NATO countries and Ukraine. It is Russia that continues the assault against Ukraine and is really thumbing its nose at President Trump's peace efforts, especially as we saw these 19 drones, Russian drone incursions into Polish NATO member, of course, airspace just recently, which elicited a NATO response. And so I think President Trump is now working with Congress to get a sanctions package ready to impose against the Russians.
Yeah. Well, therefore, isn't the burden on Vladimir Putin to stop the war and meet President Zelensky at least halfway at the negotiating table?
Well, no, this is 100% at this point. This is just Russia that continues to perpetuate the war. Ukraine clearly is willing to do what is necessary to end it. And you saw the United States join other NATO countries and more than 40 countries in condemning Russia's incursion into Polish airspace and to support NATO's efforts to make sure that Polish airspace remains secure and sovereign. So the United States is supporting this pressure now against the Russians.
Well, what needs to happen here? You've mentioned Poland a couple times, and this is a big deal this week. We've got an Article 4 incursion, and both yesterday and today, President Trump suggested that it may have been a mistake. The Prime Minister of Poland took to Twitter to say this was no mistake. I wish it was, but it's not. And there's talk of NATO beefing up its defenses along the eastern NATO front. What
Yes, I
should
think they're
happen
calling-
when this Article 4 review is concluded?
So in the Article 4, of course, just requires all NATO members to consult with Poland, who is invoking this, to come up with a NATO response. And NATO is going to have, I think they're calling it Eastern Sentry, to bolster the Eastern Front of the NATO alliance. I always like to say NATO is only as strong as the Eastern Front is secure, the Baltic countries and Poland. And so that's what we're seeing now. You're seeing some members of NATO step up and make sure that they're going to provide extra support to Poland. And that's, of course, to deter further Russian testing of the solidarity of the NATO alliance.
Yeah. Well, what is this test? What's Vladimir Putin up to? Is he trying to find the line on Article 5?
He might be. And it almost doesn't matter if it was an accident. You know, the point is it's Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It's reckless. It's conducting these attacks near a NATO border. And so I think that Putin is testing to see how NATO would respond. NATO has responded pretty good. It's provided some extra support for Poland. But the other thing that's really important, because you asked about sort of where the United States is on sanctions, it's interesting, a couple days ago, Marjorie Taylor Greene in the House of Representatives tried to defund support for Ukraine, and it was opposed in a bipartisan fashion in the House. Republicans joining Democrats to say, no, we're not going to oppose support for Ukraine anymore. So the temper has changed, and there is now broad support to put pressure on the Russians.
You're right, Rebeccah, and that did not get enough coverage. That was actually a pretty important moment, and the messaging for the White House, I suspect, was influential as well. At the same time, if an Article 4 incursion doesn't trigger secondary sanctions, what will?
Well, it should. Secondary sanctions, of course, would be against those countries that continue to buy Russian oil, which is fueling the Russian war machine. Obviously, the two countries that do that the most are China and India. I mean, I would hope that we would put more pressure on China. We still need Indian help and support for countering China. And right now, just the White House has been only willing to put sanctions on the Indians. But it is my hope that we really turn the screws on the Chinese, because they really are the ones that are backing the Russian war effort.
Rebbecah Heinrichs, you're a national security expert, and I wonder your thoughts on what's happened this week domestically here in the killing of Charlie Kirk, the political rhetoric, and the possibility of continued political violence. What happens next?
Oh, well, first of all, I mean, we're all grieving. I think that those of us who have made the point that the fact that Charlie really would go into university campuses to have open discourse to change people's minds. I mean, really, his assassination is a political assassination. It's attack on the First Amendment and really gets to the core of who we are as a free country. And so I thought Governor Cox of Utah made the really important point that there's going to be Russian and Chinese adversaries on social media trying to use this moment to further foment hate and anger and even violence between and among Americans. And it's good to just get off social media and get in the real world and hug your loved ones and get to know your neighbors.
Yeah, throw your phone in the ocean. How would you grade the FBI's handling of this case? We saw a big victory lap this morning from Kash Patel, but this is a suspect who turned himself in.
Well, I mean, I think it was his father. Just another painful aspect of this is that it was a family, it was his own father who understood that he was the one who did this. And so he went to the FBI. I think the FBI was extremely eager to catch the person who committed this crime as quickly as possible. And so there's a couple of, I think, false starts and thinking that they had caught the individual a couple of times and they didn't. But here we are only just, pretty recently after the assassination, and he's caught. And so we're glad that he's apprehended. But of course, the grieving just continues, especially as we learn that, his family must deal with now the grief, knowing that one of their own members of their family committed this just grievous, terrible assaults on the First Amendment, and of course, taking the life of Charlie Kirk, a father and a husband.
How important is bipartisanship in national security, Rebeccah?
Well, look, we've got all kinds of divisions inside the United States, and we can continue to have those arguments through our words and through persuasion. But when it comes to protecting the sovereignty and the security of the American people, it has to be bipartisan. We've got external threats, the Chinese, Russians, North Koreans, Islamist radicalism, the Iranians. are all trying to harm the United States, weaken the United States, and make sure that we can't protect ourselves and our sovereignty. And so it's crucial that we must have bipartisan support on handling and deterring and against those outside threats so that we can, through debate and discourse and our legal system, deal with the differences that we have, compromise, and go through the political process. And so it's really important, especially now, to understand that we have to get this right on national security policy.
I appreciate your weighing in on that. Rebbecah Heinrichs, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. We thank you for being back with us on Bloomberg. As we just noted, President Trump says he's running out of patience with Vladimir Putin. That sentiment is also being felt in Finland, where the threat from neighboring Russia looms large. Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix recently sat down with Finnish President Alexander Stubb to discuss how the country is preparing for an uncertain future. Listen.
Where do you see Russia going?
Oh, it's not looking good. You know, I'm very honest with you. With the current regime and with President Putin, I don't see big change. You know, nations that don't have a capacity to deal with their past, they have a very difficult time to look into the future.
The world marvels as tiny Finland halts and holds the giant invader. Soviets may command the sky of Finland, but the invader will meet resistance on Finnish soil.
There is this, you know, imperialist DNA and undertone in Russia, which doesn't seem to go away. Russia is built on empire. That's why Putin talks about the Ruski Mir, Great Russia, borders to the 1800s, which has, you know, one language, one Russia, one religion, and one leader himself. So I'm not very hopeful about the future of Russia right now.
You can watch the full interview with the Finnish president on Leaders with Francine Lacroix tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern, and available on the Bloomberg original stream starting at 8. You can also watch starting Saturday online and, of course, on the terminal. More Balance of Power ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going to Memphis. Memphis is
that's the next city.
Deeply troubled. And the mayor is happy. He's a Democrat mayor. The mayor is happy. And the governor, Tennessee, the governor is happy. Deeply troubled. We're going to fix that just like we did Washington.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. They're listening to President Trump on Fox this morning announcing his plans to, yes, deploy the National Guard next to Memphis in the latest escalation of his administration's efforts to crack down on what it calls rampant crime in Democratic-run cities. Earlier this week, the Democratic mayor of Memphis, Paul Young, was asked about the deployment and said he was committed to working to ensure any efforts strengthen our community. Memphis recorded the 4th highest homicide rate of any American city with a population of at least 100,000 last year. That's according to FBI data you can see on your screen. The new deployment offers the latest example of how Trump is turning to the military to help with policies, including domestic security, and is likely to expand a legal fight playing out in the courts over his powers. Joining us to talk about this and a lot more. It's been a heavy week in the world of politics. Our panel, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne, Democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center, alongside Republican strategist Annalyse Keller, partner at 7 Letter. So, Annalyse, we go to Memphis next, a red state, as the president suggested he would go to a blue city in a red state. Does it give him more credibility when he starts talking about the selections of cities to deploy troops?
Yeah, I think that's why he's doing this in part. Also, there's a governor there, Governor Lee, who is open to having Trump come in and support. I think Trump indicated on Fox and Friends he still had an interest in going into Chicago and some of these other areas that he thinks need federal support. But of course, when there is a governor who is unreceptive to that, at least for now, he seems like he's going to be backing off of that and instead focusing on areas like Memphis.
That list that we just showed, beginning with Jackson, Mississippi, the 8 cities with the worst crime rates, with populations 100,000. Jackson, Birmingham, St. Louis, Memphis is number 4. Jeanne, I don't see Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles anywhere in the top 10 here. Is President Trump getting it right this time?
No, I don't think so. I think he is getting it right in the context that there is a crime problem in Memphis, but of course there are crime problems in cities all over the country. The problem is, how do you execute on this? And the reality is, putting military on the ground is both illegal and it isn't effective in reducing crime. So if the president is really interested in reducing crime, and we all should be, he should look at investing in police officers, investing in training, and doing the things that those experts in the criminal justice field tell us is actually effective. But the reality is, President Trump is more interested in performance. He wants to refocus the nation's attention on crime and immigration because he can't point people to the real issue that he ran on, which he's not doing well in the polls on, and that is the economy. And he said so in the Oval Office a couple weeks ago, and he is sticking to it. And I suspect until we get through this midterm, he will be all crime, 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 unless he's able to turn this economy around.
Well, of course, he had a new reason to talk about crime this week in the shooting death of Charlie Kirk, and the rhetoric has been hot. I'd like to ask you both about what we've been hearing, and I'll start with the rhetoric from the president himself, who in the White House driveway last evening said there are radical left lunatics out there and we just have to beat the hell out of them. He was asked about radical extremism on both sides of the political spectrum in his interview earlier on Fox. Here was his message today.
We have radicals on the right as well. We have radicals on the left. People are watching all of these videos and cheering. Some people are cheering that Charlie was killed. How do we fix this country? How do we come back together?
I'll tell you something that's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't care less. The radicals on the right oftentimes are radical because they don't want to see crime. They don't want to see crime.
Worried about the border.
They're saying, we don't want these people coming in. We don't want you burning our shopping centers. We don't want you shooting our people in the middle of the street. The radicals on the left are the problem. And they're vicious, and they're horrible, and they're politically savvy.
Annalyse, we remember Timothy McVeigh, if we're old enough in some cases, and we're all old enough to remember Nancy Pelosi's husband, the Speaker of the House in Minnesota, Governor Shapiro. Is this language helping?
I mean, we really do need to put the temperature down on both sides of the aisle. But I do think that there is a permission structure when I am online, and I would, recommend everybody not spend a lot of time online because it's very dark right now. But it used to be this feeling of people, keyboard warriors, people, sort of faceless people saying things that were really had no place online, no place, cheering these types of events. I mean, I'm reminded of the United CEO who was murdered, and there is just, around the corner from me, there is a store that sells T-shirts with the murderer's face on it. So it really feels like we are in a sort of new era where there is a permission structure to cheer these types of events. And I have to be honest that most of it is unfortunately on the left. I mean, there's certainly some on the right who I think this is not language that's helpful, but that's where it's coming from right now. When we're talking about what's happening with Charlie Kirk, I'm seeing it from the left.
Sure. I just rattled off 4 instances of Democrats being targeted in the last year as well, though. Is that not a concern for you?
It's all a concern. Yeah. I think, I'm not really interested in having a body count here of who is doing what. I mean, I think it seems
like the blame game is pretty dangerous, isn't it?
It is. I think the blame game is extremely dangerous, and I think that this language is not helpful. I mean, I've spent the entire week talking to Capitol Hill staff, lawmakers who are extremely disturbed and concerned by this, and I think what is a really big issue and a potential outgrowth of this is young conservatives being radicalized by this, and I think that is something top of my mind and clearly top of mind for lawmakers who are changing their types of events, who feel like they can no longer have these public events. And I think that absolutely goes on both sides of the aisle here.
Moving them indoors in some cases,
yeah,
or postponing them in the case of lawmakers this weekend. Jeanne, I don't want to keep score here. That's not what we're here for. And I think Annalyse is right. This is not about the body count. You spend a lot of time with young people on campus at Harvard. You're also a political science professor at IoNA University. How much of this is born of the impact, the social impact of social media And is it not shared by both sides?
I think there is a good deal of blame to go around to both sides, to social media, and to other aspects of our society. You know, kudos to the Fox News anchor for asking the president a clear and important question. And I am hoping the president is learning some lessons from the masterclass that the governor of Utah gave us in how to respond to a tragedy like this if you are an elected official, because leaders have an important place in a democracy. Yes, the power rests with us, but we do depend on our leaders to lift us all up. And Governor Cox has been lifting us up, and Donald Trump today, it was sad for me to watch that, because we understand he is grieving this loss, but this is not the way you respond to that. Leaders from both sides need to set examples for the people who follow them. They don't need to go to the bottom. And that's what the president did in the driveway yesterday and what he repeated again on Fox. And to your point, this is a terribly difficult time for young people. Charlie Kirk, whether they loved him or they didn't love him, was somebody they grew up with. And they had to watch him be shot on a college campus, online, and in a place where dialogue is encouraged and should always be free from violence.
Well, as we mentioned, it was an hour-long interview this morning. President Trump made a lot of news. He talked about this. He mentioned Memphis. That's how we learned about that. He also was asked about the New York mayoral race, something we've discussed here on the program, and his intention to get involved. He wants Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa to drop out so it's a one-on-one and we don't have a Mayor Mamdani. He was asked about this, knowing he is a Republican. There is a Republican candidate in the race. President gave an answer that was cute and furry. Listen.
This is not exactly primetime, you know. He wants cats to be in Gracie Mansion. He wants to open it up as a kid. That's the home, for those that don't know.
He's a good crime fighter.
The magnificent home of the mayor. It's beautiful. Gracie Mansion, to me, is like a fabled place. If you're in New York, no, we don't need to have thousands of cats.
You didn't want cats.
Cats in Gracie Mansion. Jeanne, you're in New York. The horror. Is this going to happen?
The horror. You can tell that this is Donald Trump's birthplace, and he knows it very well, and he knows Curtis Sliwa loves his cats. He should also know I don't think there's a chance in heck that Curtis Sliwa can go anywhere but New York. He is a New Yorker at heart, and I think the Republicans are stuck with him for now, and maybe stuck with Adams unless he can entice him into some kind of ambassadorship.
Yeah, we'll see about that. So the beret is okay, but no cats in Gracie Mansion? Is that where we're going?
That's what it sounds like.
Wait, so the Republican president wants the Republican candidate to drop out of the race.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about this race is that when you try to meddle in local politics, you oftentimes get outcomes that you're not looking for.
There you go.
Yeah.
We'll see about this one. Our panel, Jeanne Shanzano and Annalyse Keller, thank you so much for the insights today. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. And thank you for being with us through a difficult week. This is Balance of Power. We'll see you back here on Monday, only on Bloomberg.